The next speaker is Annie Fenzi.
Hello.
Hello, yes. Annie.
Hi.
And she's going to talk about conceptual models for meeting the needs of adult learners in distance education. And I give it over to you, Annie.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to share my screen here. And when I share my screen, I'm on a laptop, so I can't see anything. So I can't see anyone in the room, and I can't see the chat or anything like that. So I guess you'll have to unmute and speak up if you want to interrupt with some questions. My name is Ann Fency, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Maine, where I research adult learning and distance education. I've been an adult educator for about 20 years now as a teacher, as a professional developer, as an administrator, and I've worked in both adult education and higher education. I also teach computer applications, educational technology, instructional design, and my background and research have helped me to kind of pull together what I hope will be some helpful recommendations for working with adult learners in distance education. So before we get started, I'd like to find out where you are all from. So we will be using Poll Everywhere throughout this presentation. So if you want to open another window or use another device, you can have both of these available if you're on a laptop joining remotely. The URL is pollevfensie676. And I'm going to paste that link in the chat for you so that you don't have to try to, let's see, put that in the event chat here. So you can click on that. And there we go. So you should see a map on your screen. And you should be able to just click right on the map where you're from. So it looks like we have someone from the Midwest, someone from China, someone from, I think that's Germany. No, that's, yeah, I think that's Germany. That looks like Brazil. Wow, we've really got people from all over. That's really exciting. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to be modeling some effective practices. So by placing yourself on the map and seeing where everyone else is from, it helps you to imagine that there's actual people in this session. So we're not just faces on a screen or names on a screen or anonymous people in the room next to you. We actually feel like you're connected to real people. And that's an important component of distance education because it will affect how you learn. Ooh, someone's from the North Pole. Or maybe that was just clicked in the wrong place. So another thing to check in with you is, how are you feeling right now? You can interpret these faces however you want to. Oh, it looks like people are on the positive end of things. I'm glad to see no one is over here in red. All right, now the next thing I'd like to do is to activate your prior knowledge before we begin talking about this topic. So what 3 words would you use to describe adult learners in distance education? Go ahead and type in those 3 words here. And this helps me as the instructor get an idea of what you already know or believe about the topic. And it helps prime you for what we're about to discuss. So learning consists of connecting new experiences and information to prior knowledge. So priming these connections can help the learner make those connections so the learning sticks. And we'll look at some other strategies for making it stick. Speaking of making it stick, I also highly recommend the book Make It Stick by Peter Brown, Henry Roediger, Mark McDaniel. All right, so we've got some independent, part-time workers, students, slow, usually old, grandchildren, 25 years, self-directed, part-time, mother, non-traditional. Yeah, so a lot of these are, self-directed. We find that in the literature that they really are. So let's do a little trivia now. So what percentage of undergraduates are age 24 and older? So just how many college students are actually adults? A little or a lot? So what do you think? Maybe 10% of all undergraduates are adults, 20%, 40%, 60%? Well, we've got some informed people or good guessers in here because the correct answer is 40%, a little over 40% of undergraduate students are adults. So that's actually a big portion of the undergraduate student population. So we really should be paying attention to adult learners. Now, how many of those adult learners enroll in distance education of some kind? So is it 1/4, 1/3, 1/2, or 3/4? So we have some people guessing 1/4, 3/4, half. And 1/3. Kind of evenly spread here. So actually, just over a half of adult learners are enrolled in distance education. So they also, though, make up the majority of all online learners. So if we're talking about just online learning, most of them are adult learners. But there's still a good chunk of adults who want to be in a physical classroom online. So this is a population that we really need to pay attention to. And we also see that distance education is a practical option for many adult learners who may not be able to make it to campus for classes. And distance education is continuing to grow at really rapid rates. But here is where it becomes really important. Traditional college-age students are how many more times likely to graduate than an adult student? You think they're twice as likely to graduate? 3 times, 4 times, or 5 times? Whoops, got the wrong screen on there. Again, we're kind of split here. And actually, it is about 4 times. So adults are about 4 times less likely to graduate from higher education than a traditional age student. And that number really depresses and frustrates me. And it's why I continue to work in this area. There's also a lot of talk nationally about increasing degree attainment for adults and upskilling the workforce, but adults are not doing as well as younger students. And a lot of the national discourse is around the deficits of adult learners. So instead of thinking of adults as deficient, I think the real problem is that our institutions of higher education are not designed to meet the needs of adult learners. So the good news is that faculty approaches to instruction can impact adult learner success. So the way that faculty teach can really make a difference in how well adult learners do in their class. However, while faculty may have positive attitudes toward their adult learners, they do not adapt their instruction to meet their needs. And so this brings me to my research question. What are the important factors to consider when designing instruction for adult learners in distance education? There are a lot of recommendations about how to work with adult learners, but much of it is lacking empirical support. Adult learners are just not studied as much as traditional age college students. I'm currently conducting a scoping review of the literature on adult learning in distance education, and we're finding very few studies that actually look at the learning processes. Most of them simply report on learner satisfaction or how to design instruction for adults. So I went broader into the literature than the education field, and I looked at workplace training research, aging research, and adult cognitive neuroscience research. And I discovered several factors that are unique to adults that can impact their learning that we should consider when designing instruction. And these are grouped into cognitive, social, and emotional factors that are common among adults. So first, let's do a little poll about what it means to get older. So we'll go back to poll everywhere here. And tell me whether you think this is true. Aging is all loss and decline. Yes or no? Well, we got some people who think that it is, and some people, majority of people, don't think that's true. And you're right, the literature does not support this statement at all. And there are some things that improve with age, like intellectual and personal development, emotional experience and regulation, and subjective well-being. All of these things continue to improve throughout most of the lifespan. All right, how about this one? Do you agree that adults have no control over age-related loss and decline? Can you control any of those things that are changing? So most people think that that's not true. And you're right, that's a myth. There's literature that refutes this statement. So for example, in a meta-analysis of twin studies, genetics only accounted for about 30% of age-related memory changes, meaning that our environment and our experiences play a large part in our development. Other research suggests that behaviors that are within our control, like diet and exercise, not smoking, or engaging in intellectual stimulation, all affect lifespan development and functioning. And finally, age-related loss and decline is irreversible. Do you think that's true or not? I think you're kind of getting the hint now that these are all false. The literature shows that this is a myth too. One large longitudinal study, the decline in inductive and spatial orientation that occurred over 14 years was reversed for 62% of participants after completing a 5-hour training program. So they were actually able to reverse the effects of aging with training. So to summarize, aging is not all loss and decline. We do have some control over any decline that we do experience, and some loss and decline can be reversed. So education, training, and other mental stimulation can be beneficial to cognitive functioning throughout the lifespan. So another reason why adults really should be involved in higher education. So let's begin with some cognitive characteristics that differentiate adults from traditional age students. So I'll give you a second to process this graphic. Lots of little tiny words on the screen, so wish I could make that bigger. So this graphic shows some of the specific visuospatial and verbal memory tasks and their performance by participants in different age groups. You can see that most of the tasks that require mental processing begin a steady decline right away throughout adulthood, while those that are related to knowledge remain steady or increase throughout the lifespan until late in life. We also call this fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. So several studies have shown fluid intelligence to decrease steadily throughout adulthood, while crystallized intelligence is maintained or even grows until later adulthood when it begins to decline. And here's another chart showing some of those specific abilities split out. So let's check your understanding. So an important component of the learning process is retrieval of information. It's just as important to get the information out as it is to get it in. Every time you remember something, the memory trace gets stronger. So let's try to remember what you just learned. So an important difference between youth and adults includes slower mental processing in adults, but more depth of knowledge, faster processing in adults and more depth of knowledge, slower processing in adults and some loss of knowledge, or faster processing in adults and some loss of knowledge. Ooh. So, like the charts, we generally see the processing. So, being able to do multiple things at the same time and the speed at which things happen, that does slow down. But the body of knowledge and depth of knowledge maintains and increases throughout adulthood. So let's look at how learning happens so we can see why this is important. So imagine that these triangles on the left are all pieces of content knowledge from a course. These are controlled by teacher instruction, and they exist in the classroom environment. Now, over on the right is the learner. This circle inside the head represents working memory or thinking. And the sets of triangles are all connected memory networks in long-term memory that we call mental schema. You can kind of see some of them are grouped together by colors because they're different things that we know. So there's not enough room in the graphic to put this inside the head, so it's floating on top, but you can imagine that that's actually inside the brain. So this long-term memory is composed of episodic memory, which are mental reenactments of specific incidents. So like when we remember an event that happens, that's called episodic memory. Semantic memory, which is the essence we've distilled from all those experiences to form knowledge structures, or those mental schema, those triangles. And procedural knowledge, which is our ability to store a process or a skill. So the goal of learning is to get the information we are thinking about into our working memory, from our working memory into our long-term memory. And when we pull this information from our long-term memory into our short-term memory, we're remembering. Now, what happens when we learn is that we search out our memory banks for related information to the new content so that we can connect it, which can then be incorporated into the mental schema. So this process is called encoding. If we don't have sufficient prior knowledge, a metaphor can be helpful to create the mental schema here. Now, there's often interference in this process, typically in working memory. And this might come from being distracted, either by something in the environment or with your mind wandering. It could be a lack of motivation to learn the content or a cognitive overload because the information is too complicated or difficult to access. Or you've got a lot going on in your life. In that case, the information may make its way in, but it doesn't get stored in long-term memory. So it just kind of went in one ear and out the other, as they say. Another problem might be that the information is so new or contrary to prior beliefs that it just doesn't fit into the existing mental schema. And actually unlearning information can be more difficult than learning it the first time. So this is another important thing to consider about adults, is that sometimes they have misconceptions. So not only do you need to teach them the opposite of it, but you need to help them unlearn that misconception. So now, what was taught? And as the teacher, you know that you taught these three pieces of information. And the important question is, what was learned? And you can't see inside your students' brains, so what do you do? This is where formative assessment and feedback can be helpful to both you and your learners. If you ask students to recall the three pieces of content, especially after a delay is when it's really beneficial, then you can see what they actually have in their long-term memories. So here you can see there's only one piece of that information. And this is called retrieval or retrieval practice if done frequently. It is an instructional strategy with consistently one of the largest effect sizes in studies. So now you can see that the student only recalled one piece of content when you taught three. And this lets you know that you need to review the content, provide remediation, or maybe do some detective work to find out why the content didn't stick with that learner. As I mentioned before, the more times you retrieve the memory, the stronger the memory trace in long-term memory. So if a neural pathway is used multiple times, the brain will coat that pathway in myelin, which insulates the nerve fiber and makes the connection move faster. I did say there were some things that were common among adult learners, but in truth, your adult students are a very heterogeneous group. There is a lot of variability among your learners, and you can Google Digital Promise. They have a great a tool online called the Learner Variability Project, and they've synthesized a lot of the research on adult learners and how to address this variability. So one way that learners vary is in their sensory register. All of the information that comes into our working memory has been filtered through these sensory buffers, which can be influenced by physiology or expectations. Another important way that learners vary is in the capacity of their working memory. As we saw in those charts, our mental processing speed begins to decline throughout adulthood, and some learners also naturally have a smaller working memory capacity. So this means that we can't tax them with too many things at the same time or pressure them to rush to get things finished in a short amount of time. This can lead to cognitive overload. Finally, and probably most importantly, learners vary in their long-term memory. Each learner has a unique collection of mental schema built from experiences, learning, and beliefs. And adults have the advantage of a more complex mental schema with more depth of knowledge than younger students. But we don't tap into this in our course design very often. Instructional designers often target an average student with assumptions about what the student already knows. We'll talk about some strategies in a minute for addressing this. Other cognitive characteristics of adults that impact learning include the ability to quickly switch tasks. So that peaks in adolescence, and it is more difficult to return to a task when you have been switched without preparation, so like a distraction. Similar to what we saw on the chart, working memory-related tasks begin to decline when people are in their 30s, while some abilities continue to develop, like facial recognition, which peaks actually in your 30s. Myelination in the frontal cortex, where reasoning, planning, and other executive functions are located, is not completed until the mid-20s or 30s. Myelination is important as it is strengthened by frequent use and improves the efficiency of neural connections. So in addition to structural changes, chemical changes also happen in the brain throughout adulthood. So for example, dopamine, which is necessary for executive functions, gradually declines through adulthood, while semantic memory, or our basic knowledge and cognitive schema, continues to grow throughout most of adulthood. Episodic memory begins to decline in the 30s. So we have a harder time remembering specific episodes or connecting your knowledge with a specific incident. And fuzzy trace theory suggests that we simultaneously encode two types of memory at the same time: specific details, or verbatim memory, and the essential meaning, or gist. And adults excel at gist memory, while children rely heavily on verbatim memory. They're not as good at seeing the big picture. It is also important to note that while much of these changes are common in adulthood, the variability of individuals continues to increase with age and life experience. So adults are also a more heterogeneous population than traditional college students. So let's look at some social characteristics of adult learners. Student is often just one of many identities in the complex lives of adults. In a national study of undergraduates, participants were asked to identify themselves as employees who study or students who work. So this helped figure out which is more the salient identity for them. They all combined work and school, but one of these identities was more dominant for some adults. So 2/3 of working adults identify first as an employee and second as a student. while a third identify first as a student and then as an employee. They were not asked to rank their other identities, so we can imagine that some might first identify as a spouse, a parent, a parishioner, an activist, a person of color, someone with disabilities, or a number of other combinations. The average age of employees who study was 36. More than half of the employees who study were married, while less than a third of students who work were. Employees who study were more likely to be parents or other caregivers, and the majority work full-time. Most of the participants who identify first as a student only worked part-time. And not surprisingly, 3/4 of those who identify first as an employee attended school part-time, and some people noted that in the beginning of the session. And finally, employees who study were more likely to attend community college, while students who work were more likely to attend university. So another important social characteristic of adult learners is how much time they spend on their coursework. In one recent large study, more than half of the adult learners spent at least 12 hours on each course assignment, and a third spent more than 21 hours on each assignment. And this is in addition to the average of 5 hours they spent per week on study. And adult students of color were more likely to have negative past school experiences and lower degree completion. So let's look at some emotional characteristics. Enrollment in a degree program often happens after some sort of life crisis, like losing a job or ending a marriage. And these students have the emotional burden of developing a student identity in addition to managing the emotions of their life changes. And many researchers have discovered an increasing need for emotional meanings in things that they choose to engage in, like work, life, and relationships. While many adults enter higher education for work-related needs, the majority of them also report emotional reasons for enrolling, like feeling accomplished or personal growth, or even being a role model for their children. And more than youth, growth and accomplishment are motivators for adults. It should also be noted that adult competency and self-efficacy may not translate to the classroom. To be an adult means to be competent, although when adult learners enter higher education, they compartmentalize their prior experiences of understandings of self-efficacy and competence in their adult life worlds, believing that their backgrounds have limited or no value in the academic world. So many adults will try to take steps to protect their self-image by avoiding failure instead of taking challenges. And also threats to social identity can increase cognitive load. So here is the model. It includes the 3 domains of cognitive, social, and emotional factors, and they're all influenced by the context of the learner and the learning environment. So in the cognitive factors, we've mentioned prior knowledge, and I am going to post and share these slides. I'll post a link in the chat so that you can get to all of these. In the interest of time, I'll just run through some of these pretty quickly. But I do have, for each of these factors, some instructional strategies that will help you in the classroom to address the needs of adult learners for the cognitive, social, and emotional factors. And finally, it's important to understand context, because context can actually shape the brain. So in one study, it was interesting that they had Chinese adults and American adults look at these pictures and track their eye movements. And they found that the Westerners really focused quickly on the focal object in the center of the picture, whereas the Chinese adults spent more time observing the background and the whole picture. So doing that throughout your whole life changes the way that your brain is structured and the way that you approach things. So it's important to really understand your learners so that you can understand how they are approaching your course content. So to summarize, adult learners are a very diverse group of people, and it is important to get to know them, find out what they know, what their challenges are, and what is important to them. Understanding the cognitive, social, and emotional factors related to adult learning and distance education can help you to design instruction that is better suited to their needs and ways of learning. And think of your adult learners as assets in your classroom and capitalize on their strengths. Intentionally plan this into your course design. And finally, try to minimize unnecessary burdens for your adult learners to increase their opportunities for success. And thank you so much. I don't even know if there is enough time left for questions.
Thank you very much, Annie, for your interesting talk. I think we have time for at least one question, if there is any. Does anybody has a question here? No questions? Can you have a look? Is there a question in the chat? There's no question in the chat, but I think this was a very interesting talk. And if you would provide your slides, I think all guys here are very pleased. So put the link in the chat, and maybe see you tomorrow as a participant again.
Yes, great. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Annie.